So we built our first custom component from scratch, the header component. And that is something you'll do a lot when working with Angular because you'll be working with a lot of components. Now, as you can imagine, if you build more and more components, since most components consist of multiple files, the app folder will grow rather quickly, and managing all those component files can become rather cumbersome quickly. That's why it's common to put component files into subfolders inside of that source app folder. For example, here we could create a new subfolder called header for the header component files. And the convention is to use a folder name that just describes the feature the component is being used for. So the header in this case. So we could then grab these three files and move them into this header folder. Now with them moved, you should just make sure that in the app component TypeScript file, this import path here is updated accordingly. Many IDEs and code editors will do that automatically, but you should double check to make sure that you are now importing the header component from that header folder. And with that, if you save everything, the app should still work as before, but now we have a better folder structure. That's not the only thing you can and should do to work with components more efficiently. Instead, you can also use the Angular CLI to get some help with creating and managing components. Because let's say we want to add another component to this application, a component that will output an individual user, which we can select to view the tasks of that user. Now we could, of course, manually create a user folder and then add all those component files. And that wouldn't be wrong, and indeed I personally often create new components like this. But you can also use the Angular CLI and run the generate command to generate a new component, for example, for this application. You can also generate other things, but here we need a component. And you do that by running ng generate component, or you can actually shorten this to nggc, and then the name and path of your component. So for example, user, if you want to create a new user folder with the user component files. If you then hit enter, the Angular CLI will go ahead and create some files for you in a newly added user folder. And of course, we can see that here in our project structure. This user folder was now added by the CLI, and in there you find the user.component HTML file, so it's automatically following that naming convention I described before, the user component TS file, and the user component CSS file, which is empty at the moment. You also find a user component.spec.ts file, which is used for automated testing, and we can delete that right now since we'll dive into automated tests later in the course, not right now. But with that, we now got the same three files which we previously created manually, now created automatically by the CLI. In the user component.ts file, you also see that it automatically set up a fitting selector for us, following that naming convention I described before, and set up the links to the external style files. It also set standalone to true, since that's the recommended default nowadays, and added this imports array in case we would want to use other components inside of that component. We can delete it if we don't plan on doing that though. Now that we have this newly added user component and its files here, it's time to fill it with some life and content, and it's also time to dive into additional essential Angular features. Now, as a first step, I want to start by changing the markup of this user component. And I want to change it to have a div, and inside of that div, a button, a standard button. In that button, I then want to have an image of that user, and we'll set the source attribute soon. For the moment, I'll just leave it like this. And then next to that image, a span, which will in the future include and output the name of the user. So that's the general markup I'd like to have here. Now, in order to make sure that this markup and content then also looks good, we should also set up some stylings here, and therefore attached you find an updated user.component.css file that includes some CSS styles you can paste into your user component CSS file, so that we have some styles that make the user component's markup look better. Now, the user component.ts file already looks good the way it is. We have the selector, we have the links to the template and the styles, and we have the standalone setting, so we don't need to change anything here right now. And therefore, as a next step, we can get started using that user component in the template of some other component. And that other component will again be the app component. So the root component of our Angular application. Here it's below this header where I want to output my app-user component like this. But of course, as I explained before, it would not work just like that, because Angular would not know this element. And indeed, it's telling me that it doesn't know the element right inside my IDE right now. Now, the fix is easy. As you learned, you need to import the component into this app component TS file and then add it to this imports array. And we could do this manually here, but conveniently, Angular offers me a shortcut here in Visual Studio Code. If I click on this light bulb here, I get some quick fixes suggested, or one quick fix in my case actually, which is that it will import and add this user component for me. So by simply clicking on that, that will be done, and as you can see, the import was added and the user component was added to this imports array. So that's now looking good. With that, we're using the app user component here, and now there's just one other little change or improvement we can make here. And that is that if you have a component that doesn't have anything between its opening and closing tags, which neither the header nor the user component have, and you will learn how you could build components that do accept content between their tags later. But if you have components that don't have anything between their tags, you can simplify this code and simply write self-closing components like this, by adding this / at the end of the tag and then shortening this code. Now with that though, if you now save this, you should see this user component here. Now, of course, the styling is a bit off. This takes up way too much space because I just added it like this into the app component, and the app component doesn't restrict the width of the user component. And the styles of the user component have no rules regarding the width. Therefore, to improve the look of this, I'll change the markup of the app component template, and I'll add the main element, so the standard HTML main element, and wrap that about app user. And I'll then also add an unordered list with an ID of users for styling purposes. And in that unordered list, add a list item and add app user in that list item. And now to make sure that this all looks good, I'll just copy the styles from the attached app component CSS file into my app component CSS file here. And I'll overwrite all the existing styles in that component with the ones from the attached file. With all that done, if you now go back, the user component should look better. But of course, it's still missing the image and a proper name. And that's what we'll work on next. So at the moment, the image and the name here, of course, are not final. They're just placeholders, and the image is actually not displaying anything. Now, the finished app we're building here should actually support multiple users. That's why attached you find a dummy users.ts file, which you can copy and paste right into your app folder next to the app component, for example. This file then includes an array with some dummy user data, where every user has an ID, a name, and an image identifier. Now, at the moment, we don't have those images yet, but that's why attached you also find a users zip file, which you can download and extract to then copy all the images you'll find in the extracted folder into a users folder in your assets folder. So that in the assets folder, you have a users folder, and in there you have all these user images. And the names of these images are the image identifiers you'll find in the dummy users TS file. And now with that added, my goal now is to draw a random user from that list of users inside of that user component, and to then output the name and image of that randomly drawn user. And to achieve this and implement this feature, we'll now finally have to learn about some Angular features that allow us to output dynamic content. Because thus far, all the markup we wrote has been static. There has been nothing dynamic in it. But now, since we plan on drawing different users, we need to change this markup in the user component such that it can output different images and different names with the same markup. And that's what we'll dive in next.